Using power tools to carve your way out of prison, packing yourself into a box and letting UPS take care of the rest, and how many times can one man escape from prison? I'm your host Che Arena, and we have all of this on today's top 5 scary list. Coming at number 5, we have David Sweet and Richard Matt, 2 convicted killers that were locked away in a maximum security prison that were never supposed to get out, but it turns out that several feet of concrete and steel wasn't enough to keep these guys locked up. These two were cell neighbors, and they would spend their time talking to one another about how much they hated being in prison and what they should do to get out. Well, it turns out that these dudes were not all talk and actually came up with a plan that was even craftier than a Hollywood movie.
Hey, wait a second. Move.
These guys waited until lights out. When the guard did their final tour, both these guys were still in bed. From there, everything is speculation, but it would seem that these guys both got up and somehow had power tools in their cells. The wild thing is, if you go into the prison report, there weren't any power tools missing, so that means these guys either had someone on the inside who was working with them and snuck them power tools from the prison, or even crazier, there was someone on the outside who was able to pass them power tools on the inside. Well, the police discovered that these two men were not in their cells, and the first thing they noticed was that they had makeshift dummies in their beds, so no one could tell that they were not actually in their beds. Then they saw a massive hole in the wall which they followed through, and they were able to break down how they escaped. They cut a hole in the wall and got into the framework of the building. From there, they followed some catwalks to some piping and used the piping to shimmy down 4 stories and get into the sewer system below the prison. After this, they came to a large gate that was chained up with a massive padlock. They cut through the lock and were able to get through the door in no time. From this, they were able to get to a manhole and some fresh clothes that they had stolen, and after that, they were finally out of the prison. One of the best pieces of this crime was the fact that they left behind a note that said, "Have a nice day." That's a pretty savage way to leave your mark behind, so people know that you were not only gone, but also so rude with the whole thing. Thousands of people were questioned in this case as to what happened to these men, but no one really had any answers. Some of the conspiracy theories around this escape say that these men were able to bribe people in the prison, or they might have had dirt on the warden, but that is all hearsay. The only way we'll really be able to get to the bottom of how these men were able to sneak out of a maximum security prison in a single night without anyone knowing is if they get caught. And even if they get caught, they might never spill the beans on this story. And guys, make sure that you like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It really helps us out. Coming in at number 2, we have Frank Abagnale. If you've seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, then you actually know a decent amount about one of the best con artists of all time. Frank Abagnale started writing fake checks when he was only a teenager, and he would try to impersonate every professional to try and get ahead. He impersonated doctors, lawyers, pilots. All of them were in the wheelhouse of faces that this guy would try and pull off. There was one time where he posed in front of a bank claiming to be a security guard and stood next to the cash deposit box. He told everyone that the box was out of order and they needed to leave their deposits with him. One by one, they left packages of cash with Frank, who had zero affiliation with the bank. He walked off with thousands with this little scheme. Now, eventually the police caught up with him and they were able to arrest him and send him to prison. He was arrested in Britain and he was on a plane headed back to JFK, but right after the plane landed, he was able to slip away and was on the run for a few more months before the police caught up with him again. They had him in handcuffs, and this time he wasn't going to get away. It seemed that this was a done deal for Frank Abagnale, but when he was in processing, he saw a golden opportunity. The corrections officer who was processing him didn't have his paperwork, and this seemed very strange, but they were going to lock him up anyways, of course. Well, Frank would slip something in to ensure he was able to make another escape. He told the corrections officer that the reason that he didn't have his paperwork was because he was actually doing an inspection of the prison and was actually a government official. At the time of Frank's arrest, many prisons around America were under inspection because of civil rights violations. So this correction officer took the bait. They thought they could pull a fast one on this so-called inspections officer by giving him the best treatment that he's ever seen, and they would let him be on his way, and that's exactly what they did. Frank was treated like a king for a week straight. He got everything he wanted in the cushiest prison experience imaginable. Then right after he was able to walk out the doors a free man. Eventually, word about this got out to the press, and this is what made him a celebrity around the globe. But of course, Frank was later arrested again, and this time he didn't escape. But when he was released again, he would start working with the CIA to try and crack down on counterfeiting. Coming in at number 3, we have Glen Stark Chambers. If you're the one on the outside looking in, it would seem that getting out of prison would be one of the hardest things you could ever do. You would have to be some sort of mastermind that could rival Batman. You have to come up with a plan that has every little detail figured out, because one slip up could have you back behind bars or in solitary confinement. But then you hear some of these stories of how people were able to break free from prison, and you realize you could really be anyone and you could sneak out. You just need to be bold enough to do so. This is pretty much how Glen Stark Chambers was able to get out of prison. Chambers was a murderer, and he was actually supposed to be dead before he ever got the chance to slip out of prison. He was sentenced to death row, and everything was teed up for lethal injection, but then his sentencing was brought down to life in prison. I'm not sure which one is worse. Well, for Chambers, spending life in prison was a much better alternative because it gave him the time to plan his escape. So one day, Glen was working in the furniture packing area in the prison. You had to build couches and then put them into boxes, load them onto a van, and the van would take them to who knows where. Well, Glen had the split-second idea that why not, instead of putting a couch into one of these boxes, I put myself into one of these boxes. He got his prison buddies to pack him up in there and then load it onto a van, and guess what? Nobody noticed. He was loaded onto the back of a van and taken right out of the prison, and not a single person realized that one of the prisoners was missing from the group, not until they did head count later that night. But by that time, Chambers was long gone. The van that Chambers got into eventually pulled over. Chambers used this opportunity to burst out of the box and change his clothes. He was smart enough to bring some civilian clothes to change into, and right after that he was out of the back of the van and off running. Chambers was being held in the Florida Polk Corrections Facility. Chambers already had family in Florida, so it's suspected that he first ran off to go meet his family, who then helped him hide when he was on the run. There have been reports of him both in Alabama and in Florida, but none of these sightings have turned into an arrest. Coming in number 2, we have Empress Matilda. In the year 1142, there was a war raging across England, and the Empress Matilda was being held captive. Her cousin Stephen knew that the throne was his and he was going to take it right from her hands, and he imprisoned her and took over the country. Well, Matilda wasn't going to take this lying down. She waited until winter and came up with a plan for escape. There was a large lake that separated her castle from the Wellington Castle, and she knew that if she could make it across this lake, she could find sanctuary there. So she crafted her own ice skates, put on a large white cape for both warmth and camouflage, and took off skating across the lake one night. She was able to make it to the Wallingford Castle, and eventually there was a truce made in the war. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have Yoshi Yoshida, probably one of the wildest escape stories you will ever hear. Yoshi Yoshida escaped from prison 4 times. This guy refused to stay in prison. First, Shiratori was arrested after a short trial, and he was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison, and they slapped on another 20 years on top of that. Well, Shiratori didn't like this one bit, and when no one was looking, he climbed the walls of the prison and took off on foot. That's one way to break out of prison. You just use sheer upper body strength. This was in 1936, and he would spend a few years on the run, not needing to worry about the crushing pain of a prison. But then in 1942 he was caught again and would use a similar tactic of scaling the walls to sneak out of prison life. You think after breaking out of prison twice you would never go back, but you would be wrong.
Some people never learn.
Shiratori was caught again in 1944, and this time he would come up with his second most famous escape plan, but in my opinion, his most ingenious. He took some miso soup that they served him in his cell, and then he used it to rust the lock on his handcuffs and the lock on his cell so they could both easily be broken. Then after everyone went to sleep, he snapped them both open and was on the run before anyone woke up. He would spend another 2 years in the wild running from the police, but when he got caught the next time, he would be sentenced to death. Well, Shiratori wasn't about to die in prison. If you haven't realized by now, this guy isn't someone who you tell what to do. So Shiratori tunneled out of the prison and escaped again. He was caught one final time when he found a police officer and admitted that he was a convict, and then he was returned to jail. He wasn't given the death sentence, though he was eventually released from prison in the 60s after he served his full sentence. Alright guys, that has been our top 5 list. I've been your host Shade Arena, and until next time, keep enjoying this scary content. Coming in at number 2, we have Frank Abagnale. What? Oh, 4, yeah, sorry. Coming at number 4, we have Frank.
It's cut off again.
Oh, it's cut off again? Yeah, I gotta remember, I forgot when they're really long, it does that. I haven't done a top 5 in so long.
Yes.
And then, and that's just what, and load him onto the back of the van. And that's just what he did. Okay, okay. Coming in number 4, we have Empress Matilda. Coming in number 2. I don't know why I
Started at the 1.
yeah. And then he used it to rust. And then he used it to rust.